I'm Peter Rosenblum, and I teach in the Human Rights program at Bard College. And it's always a pleasure for me to be a part of the Arendt conference. I'm here to introduce and then moderate the discussion with Suzanne Nossel. And Suzanne, as it says in your program, is the Chief Executive Officer of PEN America and author of Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. Prior to joining PEN America, she served as the Chief Operating Officer at Human Rights Watch and as Executive Director of Amnesty International USA. And as we were talking just before, Suzanne is one of those who really has been deeply involved in the emergence and evolution of human rights in the United States and human rights organizations. She also worked in government for a period during the Obama administration. She's nodding her head. And the Clinton administrations, and has been, say, part of both the exciting and interesting expansion of the institutional human rights world in New York, and now as a thoughtful commentator on where some of the issues are headed as she continues to lead PEN America. So I'll turn things over to Suzanne, and we'll have discussion afterwards and wrap things up with Roger at 6 o'clock.
Okay, thanks so much, Peter, and thanks to Roger and the Arendt Center for having me. We live in a society that is both riven by polarization and at the same time repelled by it. Pew data from this summer shows sharp increases in the proportion of Americans who regard those from the opposing party, whether it's Republican or Democrat, as more closed-minded, dishonest, immoral, and unintelligent than other Americans. A Georgetown poll asked people to grade the country's level of political division on a scale from 0 to 100. 0 is completely unified, 100 is the edge of civil war. Respondents gave a mean score of 71.74, a number that is creeping up. But at the same time, Americans are alarmed by the tenor of our political discourse. 78% said in 2019, this is obviously pre-January 6th, that heated or aggressive language used by elected officials plays a role in fueling violence. A September 2021 poll by Public Agenda revealed that Americans are united in thinking that partisan hostility and divisiveness harm the country and want a less contentious nation. Across the political spectrum and demographic groups, Americans believe that partisan hostility among ordinary people and among politicians are both very serious problems. In my work at the free expression organization PEN America, we feel this pull and tug. We're buffeted by cascading affronts to our mission and values. The devaluation of truth, elevation of lies, dogmas that have sunk in on college campuses, authoritarian impulses to ban books and gag curricula across the country, the jailing of writers around the world, punitive silencing responses to speech emanating from all quarters. We see some paradoxes. The resort to censorship, curriculum bans, supposedly in the name of countering the suppression of ideas, traditional teachings on American history, a retreat to racial and ethnic reductionism in the name of combating racial prejudice. We watch experts in the media veer from advocating greater balance and outreach to decrying both sidesism and demanding that journalism be in defense of democracy. We watch funders careen from talking about bridging across divides and pluralism to investing in building power on the left and warding off the pressure to compromise. Over the last 6 years, we've repeatedly witnessed the failure of both rage and reason and an oscillating pendulum between them. What I wanted to think about a bit today is whether and how we might ultimately negotiate a truce of sorts in our free speech wars. In the back of my mind is whether that kind of truce might portend a wider ceasefire, a triumph of cooler heads over intensifying vitriol and violence. What would it take from the right and the left to move beyond a point where conflicts over free speech seem to continually roil our campuses, our public discourse, and over the last year in particular, our state houses and school boards? So in 2020, I published a book, Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All, in which I posited a kind of a grand bargain to overcome our ceaseless skirmishes over speech. The premise of the book was sort of how we can live together in our diverse, digitized, and divided society without curbing free speech. My premise was that we were at risk of losing a rising generation of young people to the principle of free speech, one that they increasingly see as a smokescreen for hatred. Some students have come to see free speech as a conservative cause, a set of protections that reifies privilege, and an obstacle to achieving a more equitable and just society. Through our work at PEN America and my own speaking and writing, we've been making the case that unless we find a way to talk to young people about free speech in terms that resonate with their values and concerns, the moorings of free speech within our polity will be irrevocably uprooted. So in Dare to Speak, I argue that if people could voluntarily and of their own accord be more conscientious, thoughtful, and mindful of the power of speech, that many of the most frequent ill effects of speech could be blunted, weakening the demand for restrictions on speech. I make the case that the exercise of self-restraint, under most, though not all circumstances, is a key route to tamp down calls to ban and punish expression. I also argue that free speech matters as much, if not more, to the left as it does to the right. I point out that government prohibitions on speech have historically been used mostly to muzzle dissenters, women's and civil rights campaigners, anti-war resistors, and labor activists. It's those that are now mounting movements for change, be it for racial, gender, or environmental justice, who rely on free speech to be able to press their points without winding up kicked out of school or even thrown in jail. In the last few years, we brought this message directly to young people through free speech institutes, where we introduced them to dissident writers and artists from around the world for whom the denial of speech rights has led to persecution, imprisonment, and torture. I believe firmly and have witnessed that when it's introduced in the right way, free speech is a cause that resonates with the rising generation, just as it has inspired jurists, philosophers, and leaders throughout history. But I do think we need some measure of give and take for free speech to reassert its place as the bedrock of our democracy, something that transcends politics and ideology. I divided my book into principles for speakers and for listeners, believing that we need to approach both voicing our opinions and hearing out those of others in mindful ways if we are to avoid fueling calls for new and onerous restrictions on speech. The essence of my argument is that there are kernels of truth on all sides of our free speech controversies. Let's take a tough one, the N-word. Over the last several years at PEN America, we confronted repeated cases of university faculty who found themselves in hot water on campus for mentioning the N-word in a class on literature or a law school lesson on the doctrine of fighting words. The professors would insist that they meant no offense, they were mentioning the word rather than using the slur. But to students, that distinction was often lost in a sense of outrage and offense fueled calls for discipline. On the one hand, I think we can all acknowledge that the N-word is a distinctively potent slur, and that just hearing it uttered, regardless of intent and context, can spark unsettling thoughts and feelings, particularly for those whose own lives or family history have been affected by the denigration that the term evokes. The sense of affront is visceral. The feelings may surge so quickly that there isn't time to contemplate whether the offense was deliberate or even smacked of negligence or indifference. I've also argued that at this point, it's incumbent upon professors to know how the N-word lands, that they have a duty of care if they're standing up behind a podium to recognize how a rising generation hears and understands the potency of this word, regardless of the context in which it's uttered. On the other side, though, I think we all can recognize that there is a difference between using the word as a slur to insult someone or even to speak derisively about them behind their back, and using it in a discussion of slurs in American culture or as part of reading aloud a work from history or literature. Intent and context do matter when evaluating speech, and particularly when thinking about what the consequences should be. Mutual acknowledgement of all of these overlapping simultaneous truths helps point the way to how to deal with a professor who thinks he's merely referencing the N-word for pedagogical purposes, only to discover that his students are up in arms. In some instances, this kind of reciprocal understanding does emerge. When Professor Jeff Stone used the N-word in a law school class at the University of Chicago a few years ago, he was able to calm things down by sitting down and listening to his students, hearing how they heard the word. Even though he had said it for years in that class, he thought it was perfectly justified, but when he heard the student's perspective, he agreed he wasn't going to do it again. But that kind of two-way, self-reflective approach to speech controversies has become rare and often even disincentivized. I think there's something similar when it comes to the harms of speech. Free speech defenders have historically been reluctant to admit that speech can cause genuine harm for fear of opening the door to censorship. Some assail those who argue that speech can be triggering or cause trauma, calling such claims overstated or even hysterical. I understand the hesitation to stress the harms of speech, but believe that the attempt to deny that speech can cause harm has backfired. In Dare to Speak, I cite clear evidence that people on the receiving ends of slurs and stereotyping throughout their lives do suffer from academic, psychological, and even physiological repercussions. For them, at least, speech really does cause harm. Toni Morrison, in her 1993 Nobel Prize in Literature acceptance speech, spoke about how speech could be a form of violence. I think her point was to try to instill a recognition that the wounds words can cause are profound, an appreciation that she found lacking in the wider society. So she used what I think was a form of hyperbole, talking of speech and violence as one and the same. Nowadays, the propensity to equate words with violence has become more widespread, with people arguing that political slogans and other offenses are tantamount to physical barbs. That false equivalency brings its own dangers, escalation chief among them. If your insult to me is an act of violence, why am I then not justified in responding by punching you in the face? If a protest sign calling law enforcement officers murderers is an act of violence, why would police not be justified in forcibly shutting down the demonstration? Now, that doesn't mean that I don't think there are times and places where anger is justified and should be expressed. But I think the equation of speech and violence is misplaced and is ultimately can lead to dangerous consequences. I think free speech defenders can put forth a much more credible case for protecting open expression if they own up to the genuine harms that speech can cause and take seriously the need to educate people about those harms and avert them wherever possible. If we acknowledge that these harms can and do occur, we have more credibility in pointing out that isolated or even imagined offenses don't cause such lasting damage. It then becomes possible to insist that no, speech is not the same as violence, and that not every passing incidental microaggression is the legitimate cause of enduring upset, that the most extreme reaction to speech may not be the best measure of its impact. So there's a kernel of truth to both sides. Speech can cause harm, and those harms can be imagined or exaggerated. I also argue that if we step up our commitment to rejecting overt expressions of bigotry and unite behind the imperative of accountability for hate crimes, we can forestall calls to legislate against hate speech. In my view, it's precisely because advocates believe hate speech has been uncorked to run freely through our society that they become more determined to stop it, even if that means paring back freedom of expression. If people felt more confident that our tools to combat denigration and dehumanization, counter speech, intergroup shows of solidarity, forceful responses to incidents where hateful speech crosses the line into hateful action, if they thought those methods were working better, I think they'd be less prone to demand new hope prohibitions and punishments on expression. So we can acknowledge both that hateful speech and hate crimes are serious problems and that legislative prohibitions on speech are not the right answer. So I put these ideas out there 2 years ago, admittedly at the height of the pandemic, not the optimal time to release a book, but since then I have wrestled with the question of whether and how we can operationalize this kind of synthesized approach. How can we help people see the kernel of wisdom in the other side, to moderate and de-escalate, to use speech conscientiously to avoid inadvertently inflaming debates? What's standing in the way, and how do we surmount it? In terms of what's standing in the way, which is the easier part, a few obvious hurdles. One, relevant to today's discussion, social media, where brevity is prized, passions drive algorithmic engagement, and statements can be extracted from context. It makes for a nuance-free zone. Admitting the weaknesses of your argument, hedging, or conciliating doesn't drive the kind of approval that fosters amplification. Twitter threads with caveats and counter-arguments are not the ones that travel. It's not just social media. Short-form videos, TED Talks, and even 800-word op-eds leave out a lot of nuance. Our flooded media marketplace favors a point of view succinctly stated. At Penn, when our reports get global coverage, it's generally because we have hard numbers, bills introduced, books banned, less because we brought a measured perspective to a tough issue like campus free speech or how to report on extremism. Nuance also doesn't seem to be rewarded professionally or socially. I meet a lot of people who seem to think that whatever shades they might personally discern on complex issues, acknowledging them is not their job. They've convinced themselves that the other side of the argument, be it on racially offensive speech, critical race theory, or new pronouns, is so fundamentally advantaged in the debate that an unyielding, adamant opposition is essential to kind of rebalance the scales. So they've defined their role as that of an unflagging, unrepentant champion of their side of the argument. That's what gets them booked on cable news or talk radio. If they can sustain that position throughout an interview, a panel discussion, or a conference, their work is done, regardless of whether any common ground was found or any fence-sitters became convinced. It may not matter what the conversation is about or what question was posed. Sometimes people come to a discussion not for the purpose of give and take, but to proffer prepackaged statements and answers. They take the mic and press play. In this style of discussion, which prizes the firm declaration, is this style of discussion, which prizes the firm declaration, a reaction to the chaos in our public debate? Is it a fear of being video recorded or quoted saying anything that departs from talking points? Or maybe a reaction to polarization itself, where people are drawn toward extremes and have lost sight of the value of groping toward the other side? I think the dynamic is self-reinforcing. The left thinks that the right embraces bigotry, so becomes more zealous in anti-racism. An uncompromising commitment to anti-racism is then seen to inflict guilt and recrimination on white people, thus triggering hostility to theories and approaches sometimes dubbed as critical race theory. The assault on critical race theory prompts a doubling down on challenged narratives. And this cycle goes on. That is not to equate the motives of the right and the left. They are distinct tactically and morally, but they do feed one another. One question that preoccupies me is whether and how we can break through it. Whereas for years our work on free speech and education focused mostly on threats from the left, the tables have been turned in the form of ferocious right-wing assault on college curriculum and books. We at PEN America have documented more than a dozen legislative bans on curriculum adopted over the last year, a year and a half, with hundreds more similar bills introduced in state houses. We've tracked over 2,500 books banned in the USA over the last year, in some cases legislatively. Elsewhere, lists of books are being passed around from district to district and summarily banned, wholesale. Overwhelmingly, the books in the crosshairs involved LGBTQ narratives and/or stories by and about people of color. In some communities, lists of books and resources compiled for the purpose of fostering diversity and inclusion have become book ban blueprints, with titles rejected wholesale simply for the fact that a librarian or an educator thought they reflected a pluralistic viewpoint or focused on an underrepresented group. To us, honestly, this seems crazy. It's hard for me to recognize my own country as we work on this. It's out-and-out censorship taking over our schools. Knockdown, drag-out fights at Board of Education meetings, teachers and librarians being intimidated to the point where they quit their jobs. So is there any kernel of legitimacy in this debate, any grounds for compromise? I think yes and no. The movement to ban books is comprised of multiple strands. There are people who've been waging war on public education for years, who've seized on controversial books for youth as a way to undermine local administrations, argue for vouchers, and try to seize control. There are others who see a political opportunity, not a pocketbook issue, but a backpack issue, something that hits close to home and plays into racial and gender anxieties in ways that may help activate voters in certain communities. So to find the kernel of legitimacy requires stripping away all of these opportunists who fuel the fire in service of other goals, and to realize that their motives are not on the level. Beneath that, though, there are some parents, and probably a significant number in some parts of the country, who have some genuine questions. I think one that we hear a lot is about how to introduce complex and unsettled conceptions of gender identity to young children. They wonder if talking about gender ambiguities in the early grades of elementary school may sow confusion. They worry that a full embrace of the spectrum of gender variations that we're coming to recognize doesn't reflect the values of their own town or their religious affiliation, and that they think the local public schools should reflect those values. They believe sexually explicit books should not be available below certain grade levels, if at all. They believe traditional gender roles will remain numerically predominant in society and so deserve a kind of pride of place in terms of how gender is introduced in a public school setting into very young children. Some of the authors of the most banned books in the country have said that they can appreciate some validity of debate over the right age and stage to introduce their work to kids. There are notions that even ardent opponents of book bans can consider and reflect upon. The same is true, or should be true, on the flip side. Those who are panicked about books that may introduce children to sensitive sexual topics at a young age should be able to recognize the power and necessity of those such narratives for certain children. For kids with LGBTQ parents, the chance to see themselves in books may mean the difference between feeling perpetually self-conscious about bringing friends home or welcoming your two dads to school. Librarians in Texas have acknowledged that for some teens, reading books about non-binary or transgender characters can be a lifesaver. For kids who are bullied, stigmatized, and rejected even at home, books can open up a hidden door to the possibility of a different life and a viable future. For me, and probably for many of you, I don't think these nuances are all that hard to see, and yet it's as if the two sides in our public debate willfully wear blinders, believing that looking beyond their chosen field of vision would alienate them from their allies and betray the cause. How do we move past this? There is no magic bullet. There are obviously long-term methods, some of which I talk about in the book, like expanding youth debate to teach children the virtues of learning to see issues from both sides, or using literature and film as a key to unlock empathy, or perhaps a national service program that forces Americans to work side by side with people unlike themselves. But these will take a generation to take hold. And our pitched, polarized climate, one that some argue is dragging us towards secession or even civil war, may not give us the time to wait. So what can be done in the near term? One lever lies in the authoritative voice, what I think of as the authoritative voice of nuance. People in positions of power and influence who use their voice to depart from the expected orthodoxy, like the conservative writer David French speaking out forcefully against book bans. Last year, when we gave him an award at the Penn Gala, Henry Louis Gates did so on a different issue, at a time of pitched debate over cultural appropriation, whether authors have the right to tell stories about groups other than their own. Gates gave a ringing defense of the freedom of the imagination. He said, the idea that you have to look like the subject to master the subject was a prejudice that our forebears, women seeking to write about men, black people seeking to write about white people, were forced to challenge. Any teacher, any student, any reader, any writer sufficiently attentive and motivated must be able to engage freely with the subjects of their choice. That is not only the essence of learning, it's the essence of being human. The editor of the New York Times was at the event and heard his remarks, which were then published in the paper. So will we hear a conservative acknowledge that transgender identities have a place in children's literature? Or a transgender rights advocate reckon with what signs of maturity children might exhibit as markers of readiness to comprehend the complexities of non-binary identity? Who will amplify and codify those comments? I think the Arendt Center here at Bard has been one important and intrepid force trying to convene these tough conversations and spotlight those willing to have them. Another tool we've focused on at Penn is to try to call out and stigmatize those who erect barriers to open discourse. We coined the term educational gag orders to reframe a debate that was misleadingly being talked about as one over critical race theory. We thought gag orders was a more accurate way to describe legislated prohibitions on what could be taught and studied in the classroom. The term has taken off, and I like to think it's part of the reason that the overwhelming bulk of the proposed gag order bills have not passed into law. See something similar with book bans. When districts began mandating that books be put behind the librarian's desk or subjected to a permission slip requirement, we called out the new wave of book bans, publishing 2 reports entitled Banned in the USA. We've gotten some pushback in recent months with critics arguing that some of the books we say are banned have actually remained on the shelf despite orders for their removal. In a sense, that's a win, in that people recognize that bans are disfavored. Surveys confirm that overwhelming majorities of Democrats and Republicans do say they oppose book bans. So we're now seeing patterns of some bans being overturned and have witnessed that in the midterms, open talk of book bans is less prevalent than might have been expected. So I guess my argument comes down to a case for adding nuance to the fight for free speech, recognizing that the forces that can lead people to suppress expression often stem from some kernel of a genuine or perhaps even legitimate concern. My premise is that acknowledging that concern can, at least sometimes, allow you to separate out the underlying motivation from the speech suppressive solution and oppose the latter without denying the former. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that. And while we're giving a chance to everybody to compose their questions, maybe I'll ask one or two just in terms of getting started. Do you, in this current context, are you holding to kind of the traditional ways of responding, in the sense of, I mean, Penn has been celebrated under your command for its research-based advocacy and that continuing to kind of produce the details, and the things that you've described has really been, I think, important to others who are out there. And I'm wondering, though, are you going to take a stand against content regulation at all? Is that something you would stand against? Are there no circumstances where I mean, when I was as a young sort of activist working outside the United States, I always had to characterize to Europeans and others the free speech absolutism of the United States as something that was actually kind of odd, and that we clung to a certain fictional distinction between speech and action because it worked for us. Well, maybe it doesn't work for us anymore, and that some of the European models that began with the criminalizing of speech that, for example, denied the Holocaust or engaged in race speech or others, are things that where we couldn't contemplate them in the United States 20 years ago, now they're starting to look a little bit more appealing. And yet they run counter to the traditions maybe of Penn or of the ACLU or other organizations. Do you draw a line there?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I like about Penn is that we're not a doctrinaire organization. Like, there is no sort of Bible that we have to reference about the positions that we take, and we sort of have the freedom and the leeway to look at the landscape that we're in. For example, doing a report in 2017 where we really named disinformation as a threat to free expression. We argued that even though it was overwhelmingly protected by the First Amendment, that in an information marketplace flooded by disinformation, the value of free speech would be undercut, because the value of free speech is, it's not just about being able to say your piece, it's about the ability to persuade, to get into a give and take, to elucidate the truth and separate fact from falsehood. And if all of that value is diminished, free speech loses. And so, we've been able to, I think, bring a kind of a nuanced and open-minded lens to these questions. I think when it comes to something like Holocaust denial, that the evidence that allowing it actually tamps down hatred, I think is just not there. And so, I think it may feel good to, think about passing a law that would prohibit it, but whether you're actually achieving anything, if your aim is to combat anti-Semitism, I think the experience, I actually looked at this in the book to see, what had happened in terms of levels of anti-Semitism in Germany, where they have a Holocaust denial law, and in the United States where they don't. And actually the trend lines are very similar. So it's, this is no magic bullet. I think one thing that's interesting is the decision in the Alex Jones case. Because I can see, look, that is, a decision that his speech, his conspiracy mongering, his wild theories are punishable, with an extraordinary fine. And I have to believe that other purveyors of disinformation of a certain kind, are going to be given pause. And the same thing with the Dominion lawsuit, the voting machine lawsuit, where they're suing Fox News in an effort to, claim damages on the basis that their reputation was badly sullied when these machines were accused of having broken down and given incorrect results in the 2020 election. And so, I think it's an interesting question. On the one hand, we've never been at Penn America, a fan of limiting the leeway of the press. We have supported the New York Times v. Sullivan standard, which gives the media a great deal of leeway in how they cover and talk about issues. But I think we have to recognize that information travels in very different ways, and we should be looking at these things and whether some movements in the direction of accountability for speech can make a positive difference to our information landscapes. We think of ourselves as kind of champions of open discourse, and we try to ask the question of, what can best foster that?
Do we have questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you. As I understand your talk, this whole issue about free speech involves balance. Is culture relevant to that balance?
Culture in terms of cultural differences around the world, for example?
I mean, if a different culture has different values or different practices, is that relevant?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, because I think it is relevant, but I also think there's a lot of complexity in trying to discern, what the cultural stance is. People will say certain things about, for example, Jewish culture, Muslim culture, that may be, are you talking about the religious authorities and their perspective? Are you talking about the average adherent of that religion, somebody who's observant, somebody who may be secular but comes from that background? Are you talking about a man or a woman? And the answer can be very different. And so it's hard to essentialize culture. And so I think there are, as a human rights person, I absolutely believe there are certain universal rights that we all possess, that people need to be able to exercise regardless of what setting they live in, what culture they are from. But I also recognize, in the interpretation, something like Holocaust, would we say Canada and Europe are, turning their back on free speech protections because they do allow somewhat more leeway in terms of government prohibitions on speech? I don't think so. I don't think there can be kind of an absolute global straitjacket.
So here's what the thought behind, or the actual experience behind my question. I grew up in a family where the N-word was regularly used. And yet, we lived in surroundings in which the very idea that you could be hurt by the N-word was not there. So I grew up, my understanding of my culture was it's a more robust culture. Fewer things hurt you. Fewer language practices hurt you.
Yeah, I think what I would say in response to that is, one of the premises of my book is, how do we live together in our diverse, digitized, and divided society? So, let's put the emphasis on the first word, diverse, recognizing that we're living in a society where words can land differently for different people, depending on their background. And so if you're living in a community where everybody uses this word freely and there's nothing wrong with it, that doesn't mean that there aren't people you're going to meet later on or come from somewhere else for whom it's drastically different. It also, people also make the argument, well, years ago, this was kind of considered accepted. And so, what has changed? Have people just become more sensitive? I don't think so. I think there's a greater consciousness of what this word means. There's a greater recognition that, we don't have to stand for having to hear this word. Even if maybe our parents sort of had little choice and felt, it was better to be silent, or, just were accustomed to it. We now have the opportunity to speak up and say this is unacceptable. And so, I think sort of regardless of what culture you come from, you have to recognize sort of the cultures and the backgrounds of the people that you meet, and think about, what is the breadth of this audience? What range of people may be here? You can't know the answer fully, but have some awareness, that there is a breadth, and that you want to be sort of conscious of that, as you speak and express yourself.
Your argument for dialogue sort of hinged on the example of transgender books being, decried as introducing certain topics too early, right? But the other example that you had given earlier, or rather it's not an example, it's an actuality, the banning of books written by people of color or about people of color. And I was wondering, what do you think that there is a kind of kernel of understandable truth behind that prejudice? Behind that form of banning, and what would that be?
Yeah, I don't think there is when it comes to, these books that just sort of end up on a list and it's like a biography of Ruby Bridges or Frederick Douglass. I think there is no excuse, there's nothing to be understood, and that, people have gotten caught up in a frenzy and they're acting on perhaps their fears. I think, where you can have a discussion is, when it comes to sort of how we teach complex concepts in history, how do we teach? One of the things that triggered this whole debate is the 1619 Project at the New York Times, and it was turned into a curriculum. I think some people felt, this curriculum, this perspective, puts too much emphasis on certain things and it de-emphasizes other things. And, my feeling is, look, the 1619 Project is a lens. It's a perspective on American history. It is eye-opening. It was eye-opening for tons of people to read it. That, there also are criticisms of it that, have been brought forward by serious scholars, including scholars of color. But if you're, in an ideal world, I think you're looking at multiple lenses. You're in a classroom and you're being taught a critical race theory lens. You might be taught a Keynesian lens, a Marxist lens, and you're synthesizing all of this, to kind of come up with your own understanding of the world or of American history. I think that's how it should work. I also am sort of realistic that, in every American public high school, it may not be possible to have that level of complexity. And so then, you have to make choices, and who makes those choices? We've always had in this country a long tradition of local control over schools. And so, I think that, for me, is a discussion that you can have, that you should be able to have in a reasoned, rational way about how to deal with some of these really tough topics. And, how should we view, should America be presented as just a country that, has racism at its core? Should it be presented as a country that, has made progress, that's gotten progressively better, that has done some good and important things? I think that should be a give and take. And what's so destructive about these prohibitions is they really forestall the opportunity for that conversation and that dialogue by, imposing legislation.
So we had a question here. Is someone taking the microphones back?
My question was just, in your speech, you sort of talk about how from both the left and the right, there is a lot of restriction of free speech from the left, whether that be, just with certain issues. There's a lot from the left, there's a lot from the right, and to a certain extent, it is somewhat hypocritical where you have people on the left saying, well, why are you banning these books about people of color? And you have people on the right saying, well, why aren't you letting me talk about issues like Israel or whatnot? And so my question for you is just, how do you approach people who are acting like this, who are saying you can't speak about certain issues, but you need absolute freedom to speak about others? And do you approach people from the left and the right in the same way when you're trying to bring them in to bridge the gap and to find the nuances? And yeah, just in general, how do you go and approach people who think like that? And how do you try to get them to open their minds to not only see the other side, but to think about their own side with a little bit more nuance?
Yeah. Look, it's not a new thing. This old phrase, free speech for me and not for thee. It's a very pervasive pattern of free speech defense, kind of, age old, that people are more ardent about it when it comes to a perspective or an opinion that they agree with. And there's actually, I talk about in the book that, the Supreme Court has become much more kind of ideologically driven in dealing with its First Amendment cases. That there's a New York Times study that showed that the pattern basically reveals that increasingly over time, the justices are much more likely to side on, with the free speech argument if they agree with the underlying content. And if they're a Republican appointed judge and it's conservative speech, it's a less pronounced trend on the liberal side, more pronounced on the conservative side. So, it's a serious issue. One thing we do is try to point out sort of how the tables could be turned. If you're trying to suppress debate on a certain issue, what controversial perspective do you think needs airing that, might similarly be suppressed? I've sort of told this story of a case, that I think sort of illustrates it. In Massachusetts, there was a policeman who tweeted something after the Charlottesville protests and the killing of Heather Heyer. He tweeted something, sort of on the side of the cops in Charlottesville and against the protesters, and he was fired for doing that from this police force. And, I think people kind of, certain people sort of cheered that and said, like, that's absolutely right. He never should have put out that tweet. And then a couple of years later, there was an officer who put out a photo of a relative attending a Black Lives Matter protest, and it was a poster that was critical of the police, and she was fired. And the police chief said, well, we had no choice because in this past incident, this type of speech was punishable with removal from the force. And so, that's one illustration of kind of how the tables can be turned. I'd say something else that, I think can work is trying to foster an actual give and take between people about these issues, especially if you can do it face to face and people can look at each other in the eye. It's somehow a lot harder to be absolute, and it kind of opens up the possibility of being able to see from a different perspective.
Who was first? Okay. Yeah.
Thank you for this presentation. Can you comment on the Los Angeles County Council controversy? I don't know if the controversy is the right term, but on what's happened there?
Yeah, I think, to me it's not, basically what happened was there's a leaked tape that kind of came out just this past weekend of some council members having a discussion. It was Latino council members having a discussion about redistricting. And sort of in the course of that discussion, which is obviously like very much sort of off the record and people like knew each other really well, there were some terrible things said. I'd say the worst of it was these really denigrating comments about a little boy, a toddler who's Black, who's adopted into the family of a white council member. And so this, made headline news all over the country. And I think yesterday or today, at least one person has resigned. It's been sort of progressive. They had to strip of their chairmanship and now resign. And now I think there's the pushes to get the other two to resign as well. I talk in the book about being conscientious with language, and that's an obligation that I think we all have. I think what's in this setting, I do recognize, look, they thought this was a private conversation. However, this tape was obtained, which we don't know, because I think it's terrible that they had these attitudes. And I think there's really, it's sort of as soon as you read this, you knew, this is not going to fly as a political matter. And it's really a political decision. Are these people, with this, now that we know that they harbor these attitudes, are they capable of representing and making decisions on behalf of the city of Los Angeles? And I think they lost the confidence of their constituents, and therefore, their continuing on was untenable. And so it's a stark reminder that in this digital age, is anything really ever private? And, I think for, people in public life, we've had some incidents like this before, but this is, one of the more jarring ones. And so, maybe that, there's something positive in it, that people recognize, like, there really is absolutely no space for this in any conversation.
I'm going to follow up on that with with social media. How do you think about that as the press? And one example would be something like Project Veritas. I don't know how many people know that, but this is an organization that takes people out on dates, makes them think they're having, a date with a liberal progressive person, gets them to say crazy things about how they would never do this. This happened at my daughter's school last month. They took out one of the administrators. She said all this stuff, well, we would never invite a conservative, thinking she was talking to some progressive. And then they released the video and put it online. Is this stuff that's protected? How do you, this is the privacy question. This is how you deal with private conversations. How does one even begin to think about that in this day and age?
I think they're really tough questions. And there are now, our forms of surveillance software. There's just a new report out today about surveillance software and the impact that that's having on journalists. I'm not an expert in the law, but I think, basically, I think the law is, in terms of permission to tape a conversation, if one partner in the conversation consents, it's not a legal violation, I don't believe. Someone else might be able to elaborate.
It depends on the state in part, right?
Yeah. I have not heard.
I think we were told that Los Angeles conversation was likely not legally recorded, but in New York, it's a single party consent state, and I could record my conversation with you without telling you, but I think it's state by state.
Yeah, look, obviously what they're doing is deceptive and misleading. I don't believe it's journalism. Is there a legal theory that would stand in the way of it? I'm not sure, and I don't know that I've heard it. For someone to, it's an entrapment, but it's not entrapment by the government. I think that, the government couldn't, go about, obviously the purpose would be different, but, I don't think the government could do that, but can a private individual, that happens, I think all the time in personal settings that, people misrepresent themselves and lure other people in.
Can we revive the tort of intentional infliction of emotional harm?
Yeah,
Are there
that's...
other torts that, you seem to be a fan somewhat of the use of defamation, libel. There certainly would be other torts available as...
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm a fan of defamation and libel, but I am kind of intrigued. I am sort of, I don't know, I find this Alex Jones case pretty compelling.
Satisfying.
Yeah,
I find the Los Angeles case terribly satisfying.
Yeah, and the Dominion case, I think, we have to be very careful and thoughtful. Back to the question asked from the back about, how could this precedent, be turned around? What other speech might, and it's a very real question because that is what happens. There'll be another case, I haven't thought of what it is, where somebody may rely on one of these precedents to suppress or retaliate against speech, that we think has value, that we don't, it's really, none of us is sympathetic with Alex Jones or Dominion voting, but, could there any loosening of the law be twisted in a way, that would constrict the, speech that we regard very differently? And so I think that's a question that a free speech advocate always has to ask. And I wouldn't say, I don't think, I haven't rendered a judgment. And I think that's, I'm sure something that the First Amendment experts are going to be, debating for some time. What are the risks that may be embedded in these decisions that, as you say, feel so satisfying?
All right. When talking about how the N-word affects how people feel and when it comes to how you use it, historical context in books, do you feel that minorities are justified and should be justified to feel anger or rage when it concerns to other people's freedom of speech when it affects their integrity?
Yeah, I do. I think that, like, to live together in this diverse society, that we have to recognize it's not any one group. But I do think the N word, as I said, has a special potency and is kind of unique. There's a whole book written about it. It's kind of the slur among all slurs. But it's not the only type of denigrating speech that I think people have a very powerful, visceral reaction to. And I think as a society, we have to take that into account. I don't think you can't wish it away. There's legitimacy to it. There are reasons for it. And, we have to kind of, I think, accommodate that. And I think, it's sort of happening in that these incidents I was talking about, I don't think we've had one that recently. I think people have finally kind of gotten the message that, and come to understand, part of it is sort of the cautionary effect, when you hear about somebody else who, has to bear consequences for speech, you think about your own speech. And I think professors, even if they didn't realize it a few years ago, now realize kind of no matter what, you're probably better using the euphemism, and why really do you have to speak the word out fully? And, I think some people feel like that's a diminution of speech rights. I don't think there should be, I think if there's no bigoted intention, let's say it's someone who is a visiting professor and, they haven't paid attention to all this and they come and they're reading something or they say something. I think that intent in that context should be taken into account. I don't think there should be a punishment, but I think that idea of voluntary restraint, I think, has always been, it's interesting, the concept of voluntary restraint is in the Penn Charter, which dates back to 1948. And I think all of us, like, we don't say everything that comes to mind, right? Where, whether it's with our family or at work, even the questions you're asking here, you're sort of thinking about it. And there's some things you might be, tempted to say that you don't say. And so, that's not an infringement inherently on freedom of speech. I think sometimes that sense of restraint and chill can go too far. But, the very fact that you don't say everything that you might say, is not an infringement on free speech.
Although, I think those of us here at a college, maybe others as well, are particularly concerned about those restraints becoming extremely damaging. Maybe, I think others who are professors or teaching in classrooms, that we've experienced what is a wonderful process of student awareness, but that can now lead into a place of such levels of restraint that to get students to disagree with each other starts to become very difficult.
Yeah,
Just
and I
to
think
point
that's,
that out.
that's the, it's
restraint.
like, how do you get to the kind of equilibrium here where people are, I think a big part of it to me is avoiding the gratuitous, inadvertent offenses and sort of understanding what those might be so that you can avoid the friction that they cause and actually sort of reserve the political capital for a real discussion that you want to have, a point or opinion that you want to make. And I know, of course, that's why we got into campus free speech in the first place, is exactly the concern that you're raising, a feeling that campus discussions were being shut down, that the space for disagreement and political diversity was shrinking, that, trigger warnings, calls for the campus to be a safe space, that all of that was beginning to, kind of overtake the university, and that the chance for a difficult dialogue, I think you have something here at Bard called difficult dialogue or living room conversations, that was disappearing. And so in my book, I really tried, what I trying to do is lay out principles that can make that, hold that space open. I do think, there is an alchemy to it. I do think there are certain steps that the speaker kind of does have to take in order to make that possible. But I agree with you that sometimes it sort of translates in a very crude way to, just kind of a general silencing and sort of how you get that right. There's no, magic dividing line between the self-censorship that is appropriate discretion and the self-censorship that is too much.
Yeah. Okay, maybe one last question, sir, in the middle there.
Yeah, hello. So I know like the digital age has, caused a lot of things like defamation and like leaked videotapes, but also like how the censorship of books, like it was bad for like both the left and the right. But do you also see the digital age as like something that can be used to combat the censorship of these books, since like children could have access to them maybe online through like ebooks, or also just like YouTube videos? That's a thing too now. There's other ways to access different forms of books or knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think in a weird way, or one thought that's crossed my mind is that for parents now around the country, they have a lot less control over what their kids see because of social media. The main channel we know that teenagers are using, or even younger kids, to access information is social media. And so, in a sense, I think it's that maybe that loss of control is sort of part of what is driving this effort to more tightly control that which they can get their arms around, i.e. what's on a library shelf at school. There is an effort by the Brooklyn Public Library. They've set up a QR code where people can download all of these banned books, and that's been popular, and it's, a bit of an escape hatch. But I think there's something, we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that's a solution. For a lot of kids, they're not accessing that. They may not have, internet or a cell phone. There's also the kind of discovery of, they may not want to go seek that out, but if they're in the library, and they sort of see a volume about a particular thing, they might pick it up, and that can be, I'm sure we all had the experience. Sometimes that can be transformational. You weren't seeking it out, you wouldn't have, downloaded it, but you come across it, and suddenly it opens you up to something. So I do think sort of the digital definitely kind of plays into this in a couple of interesting ways.